Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On the morning of August 15, 2019, preparations were complete for Ural Airlines Flight 178 at one of Moscow's busiest airports, Domodedovo Airport. The flight was a short journey from Moscow to Sochi. With 226 passengers and 7 crew members on board, the aircraft was ready to take off. The airport was busy due to heavy morning traffic, but the weather conditions were perfect. The sky was clear with no clouds, and the wind was light. Passengers had begun boarding the plane. Everything seemed to be just another ordinary flight. Most of the passengers were heading to Sochi for vacation. The aircraft, with its large body and powerful engines, stood out. The pilots and crew had completed their typical pre-flight preparations. These short-distance flights were usually calm and rarely involved an emergency. Before takeoff, Captain Damir Yusupov and First Officer Sergei Pirogov communicated one last time and reviewed the flight plan. Yusupov, an experienced captain with years of aviation expertise, thought this flight to Sochi would be just like any other. However, shortly after takeoff, an unexpected situation arose. As the plane took off and began to climb, a few minutes into the flight, an unforeseen danger emerged. The aircraft, still at a low altitude and rapidly ascending, suddenly flew into a flock of birds. This flock, detected by the aircraft's equipment, posed a great threat to the pilots. The speeding plane entered the middle of the flock in seconds. The birds collided with the aircraft's engines and a loud explosion was heard. The impact was immediately felt throughout the cockpit. First, smoke began to rise from one of the engines. The plane suddenly started to shake and tremble, and the flight crew immediately realized they were facing an abnormal situation. The severity of the collision could have resulted in the aircraft losing control. The passengers, shaken by the sudden jolts, were filled with fear, while the pilots in the cockpit understood the gravity of the situation. Noticing the damage to one of the engines, Captain Yusupov quickly assessed the situation with calmness. With the second engine also damaged, the plane was in grave danger. Continuing the flight was no longer an option. Yusupov quickly analyzed the situation while the plane began descending rapidly, unable to continue a normal flight. Having only one functioning engine left was a significant problem for the aircraft. However, situations like this could be managed by well-trained and experienced pilots. Yusupov and Pirogov quickly communicated with each other and began preparing for emergency landing procedures. Meanwhile, no passengers panicked. They tried to understand the situation, but no one knew what the outcome would be. While still in the air, the flight crew searched for the most suitable landing area. This was a challenging situation for a plane that was rapidly descending. However, the pilots were determined to do everything they could to control the unfolding tragedy. While some passengers wondered what would happen next, others quietly observed the developments. All of this happened at the beginning of what seemed like a routine flight, and no one could have predicted that just 1 minute later, the flight would be facing death. The plane, just a few minutes after taking off from Domodedovo Airport, was still climbing at low altitude, and the pilots were expecting a normal flight. The weather was calm, the wind was light, and visibility was perfect. However, all of these stable conditions suddenly gave way to a terrifying accident. As the plane gained altitude, reaching a few hundred meters, there was a sudden movement at the front of the aircraft. At first, the pilots thought it might just be a change in their line of sight. However, it soon became clearer that the plane had entered the middle of a bird flock. The birds, in a very large and fast-moving group, were almost as large as the plane itself. This flock of birds was composed of many birds, most likely migrating in their respective groups, while some might have been randomly flying in the area with other birds. Regardless, the plane had suddenly found itself right in the middle of this flock. Although the pilots were aware of large flocks of birds during the flight, they were not expecting such a situation. A bird strike of this magnitude is one of the greatest threats faced by aircraft and can result in catastrophic consequences. As the birds flew close to the engines, many of them collided with the aircraft's engines. The impact was immediately felt in the cockpit. First, There was a loud noise from one of the engines. The pilots realized that there was significant damage to the engines. One engine immediately stopped, followed by a loud explosion. The collision caused the aircraft's right engine to be completely destroyed. Smoke started rising, and it became clear that the engine was no longer functioning. The other engine was also damaged but had not completely stopped. The plane had to continue with one engine, but the severe damage to the other engine brought the flight to a critical point. Now, the remaining energy for the flight was provided by only one engine. However, the flight crew quickly sprang into action to control the situation. Captain Yusupov and First Officer Pirogov used their experience to rapidly assess the situation. The plane started to descend quickly. The flight altitude was rapidly decreasing, and the aircraft was in a challenging position to maintain balance. Both pilots tried to manage the situation with calmness, but there was no time to waste. The complete failure of one engine had instantly changed the course of the flight. The impact of the bird strike not only affected the engines, but also the aircraft's aerodynamic structure. The plane began to shake more due to the vibrations from the damaged engines. This placed the flight crew under a dual threat. The severe damage to the engines was putting both the crew's and passengers' safety at risk. The aircraft began to descend at high speed and was losing control. Yusupov focused on the control devices, doing his best to minimize the altitude loss using the remaining engine at full power. Meanwhile, First Officer Pirogov made rapid aerodynamic adjustments to keep the plane balanced. Both pilots, thanks to their training and experience, kept their composure and knew exactly how to act in such a dire situation. However, they were still in a very difficult position. Flying with only one engine at low altitude, their only hope was to find a suitable area for landing and bring the plane down safely. During this time, passengers on board were also in great panic. The sudden failure of the flight created uncertainty in everyone's mind. Some passengers were screaming, while others were silently observing the situation. Despite the pilot's quick response, this sudden, severe disaster had unfolded. While the plane continued to descend rapidly, the most important task for the pilots was to ensure the safety of all passengers and find a strategic area for a potential landing. Every second counted in this critical moment. After the bird strike, the sudden and violent collision had put the flight crew in an unexpected situation. However, such emergencies, requiring composure and professionalism, are moments that experienced pilots like Captain Damir Yusupov are trained for. Without panic, Yusupov quickly took action. The impact had disabled one of the aircraft's engines and the other was seriously damaged, destabilizing the aircraft. However, Yusupov, as a captain who had experienced such emergencies during training and real flights, was fully equipped to handle the situation calmly. At first, the shaking in the cockpit and the explosion sounds caused a brief shock. However, Yusupov realized that the situation was controllable. To overcome this sudden disaster, he and the crew immediately began assessing the situation with composure. After the collision, the flight crew noticed that the aircraft was unbalanced. The plane was descending rapidly and they were losing control. Meanwhile, Captain Yusupov quickly reviewed all the cockpit indicators. Recalling all the emergency protocols the crew had been trained for, he thought about the steps that needed to be taken immediately. The captain guided the flight crew appropriately and made clear decisions about the necessary actions. In such a situation, it was critical to quickly refer to the flight equipment and monitor the aircraft's condition in real time. Recalling the emergency scenarios he had encountered in flight simulators and training, Yusupov carefully monitored the vibrations and smoke coming from the engines. Yusupov quickly decided to control the aircraft's speed and begin descending. With the damage to the engines, climbing and staying in the air for an extended period was no longer possible. The failure of one engine made it impossible to gain altitude, so the aircraft could no longer rise. The only option now was to find a safe landing area as soon as possible. In such a situation, it was crucial for the aircraft to descend patiently and be directed toward a potential landing site. Yusupov focused on executing the right maneuvers to guide the aircraft's flight. Constantly monitoring the cockpit indicators, Yusupov tried to maintain control of the flight. The damage to both engines had placed the crew at a critical decision point. However, Under Yusupov's leadership, the flight crew still believed they could find a way out. He led the team with experienced leadership, and they began working together to restore the flight's balance. Each team member applied different emergency procedures, trying to regain control of the flight. Yusupov, without losing control of the flight equipment, was able to reduce the speed, use the functioning part of the remaining engine to its maximum efficiency, and identify the nearest safe landing area. To regain control of the aircraft, they had to carefully balance speed and altitude. Acting without panic was crucial for the pilots to stay calm. The flight crew focused their attention entirely on controlling the aircraft and making a safe landing as quickly as possible. The pilots made various maneuvers to balance the aircraft and prevent a potential disaster. Yusupov calmly explained the situation to the flight crew and gave clear instructions about the next steps. Everyone focused on Yusupov's commands, and this calmness played a significant role in the entire team, successfully carrying out their tasks. This coordinated action under Yusupov's leadership prevented a disaster. Advanced training and experience allowed the pilots to make the right decisions in such a difficult situation. Yusupov and the crew worked efficiently within a short time frame to restore the aircraft's balance and identify a safe landing area. This was the only way to safely land the passengers whose lives were at risk. With Yusupov's guidance and the team's professionalism, the flight crew regained control of the aircraft. These critical moments demonstrated just how skilled and experienced the pilots and crew were. Yusupov and his team, without panicking and carefully calculating every step, managed to save all the passengers. After the aircraft took off from Domodedovo Airport in Russia, it collided with a flock of birds, resulting in one engine being completely destroyed and the other sustaining significant damage. This made it impossible for the aircraft to continue a normal flight. Climbing or continuing the flight as planned was no longer an option. Captain Damir Yusupov calmly guided the flight crew, but their only goal was to end the flight safely and bring all passengers down unharmed. The significant engine failure made it difficult to control the aircraft, causing it to descend rapidly. The aircraft, losing altitude, began to drop faster, with every second causing it to descend further. This moment highlighted just how critical it was for the pilots to make quick decisions. Yusupov and the flight crew immediately sprang into action to find the nearest safe landing area. However, one of the biggest challenges in this situation was the aircraft had started descending from high altitude. With one engine completely out of order and the other seriously damaged, the aircraft couldn't cover more distance before descending. The rapidly descending plane no longer had enough altitude to maneuver. Therefore, the flight crew sought an alternative solution to overcome this challenging situation, rather than heading directly to the nearest airport or runway. Yusupov, without losing control of the aircraft, had to find an alternative landing area to safely bring the passengers down. Reaching the nearest airports or runways was no longer an option due to the severe damage to the engines. Airports, especially in the airspace of large cities, typically do not have wide-open areas suitable for emergency landings. Therefore, the flight crew began searching for a clear and spacious area where they could safely land the aircraft. When no other option remained, a large field, one of the nearest areas, was identified as their only hope for salvation. The field was vast and smooth, which meant it was an appropriate spot for the plane to land. The field would not pose a high obstacle to the aircraft, and its surroundings were carefully checked to ensure the plane wouldn't encounter any obstructions during landing. The flight crew determined that the field was long and wide enough for the aircraft to land, and designated it as an alternative landing site. Yusupov and the second pilot, Pirogov, were constantly communicating with each other while making these tough decisions. They knew that landing the aircraft successfully on this field required great caution. The crew calculated the necessary distance for landing, and by controlling the speed of the aircraft, made the decision to land. This kind of landing posed a huge risk to both the plane and the pilots, because if things weren't executed perfectly, the landing could fail and result in disaster. However, in this situation, there was no other choice, and their only hope was to land on the vast field. The flight crew began guiding the aircraft, making careful adjustments to speed and altitude. Yusupov worked to align the aircraft properly, with the limited thrust provided by the engines. The entire crew trusted each other during these challenging moments, making every step with precision. Each second was crucial to control the descent rate of the plane while ensuring a safe landing. Yusupov was confident in the process, thanks to the emergency scenarios he had learned in flight simulators and the years of experience he had accumulated. Still, landing on the field was so critical that any mistake would be unforgivable. The aircraft had descended enough to begin landing, but the pilot still had to adjust the direction carefully and remain vigilant. The plane was descending faster with each passing second, but at the same time they were approaching the optimal landing spot. The vast field represented a point of salvation, but also posed a significant test for the pilots. As the aircraft descended, the pilot steered it towards the field. Everyone in the cockpit watched silently, unsure of what would happen, while Yusupov and Pirogov focused on the landing with great concentration, unaware of how time was passing. Finally, the aircraft began to land on the field. The plane descended slowly, getting very close to the surface of the field, and the pilots made one final maneuver, successfully landing the plane on the ground with great effort and success. The flight crew's determined and calm demeanor ensured the passengers' survival. The successful landing on the field showcased the crew's professionalism in a crisis and their success in emergency management. In that moment, the lives of all the passengers depended on the crew's ability to make the right decisions and act quickly. The aircraft had lost most of its engine power and was flying at a very low altitude. Captain Damir Yusupov, together with the flight crew, was fighting with all his strength to maintain control of the aircraft. One engine had completely failed, and the other was severely damaged. The plane was descending rapidly, and every second of the flight felt like a test for the pilots. Right now, the only way to ensure the safety of the passengers and land the plane safely was a difficult landing. Yusupov had extensive experience in handling emergencies, both in flight simulators and in real flights. However, this was a situation serious enough to risk his life and the lives of his passengers. A rapidly descending plane required the full attention and skill of the flight crew. Every second was critical for the next step. Captain Yusupov, using all his abilities and experience, tried to maintain control of the aircraft without panicking, ensuring the safest landing possible. As the plane descended rapidly, Yusupov and second pilot Pirogov continued to guide the flight crew. The aircraft had fallen to a much lower altitude than expected, and the suitable landing areas were quickly becoming limited. The plane, descending quickly, required every movement to be calculated carefully. A mistake could lead to disaster. Yusupov did everything he could to control the aircraft's speed, while simultaneously working to maintain the necessary aerodynamic balance, despite the reduced engine power. Both pilots knew that the only way to land the plane safely was to remain patient and make the right maneuvers. The slowly descending plane was being directed towards the vast field ahead of it. The field presented an extremely important opportunity for the flight crew. This wide area provided the necessary distance for the plane to land safely. However, uncertainties regarding the smoothness of the field's surface required the pilots to take extra precautions and be more careful. Yusupov and his team knew that in order for the landing to be safe, they had to carefully control the engines and land gracefully on the field. The landing had to be carried out with extreme care. Yusupov took great care in maintaining the balance of the aircraft. As the plane descended, its rapid drop and the insufficient engine power required intense focus to direct the aircraft and make contact with the ground before reaching the end of the path. As the plane slowly approached the surface of the field, the pilots were aware that even the smallest mistake could lead to the plane crashing onto a rough surface. Finally, Yusupov was able to execute the landing using all the control systems successfully. The plane gently touched down on the surface of the vast field with minimal speed and in a controlled manner. Although the landing was tense, thanks to Yusupov's skill, the aircraft landed safely on the ground. After the landing, the crew immediately sprang into action, using the safest exits to assist in evacuating the passengers. Despite experiencing a significant jolt and tension during the landing, the plane's smooth descent allowed everyone to take A brief breath. After the landing, both the crew and passengers experienced a sense of relief once the aircraft was safely on the ground. Everyone on board, from the crew to the passengers, came together in the joy of surviving this challenging moment. The flight crew successfully evacuated all the passengers, and both the crew and passengers had survived the incident. Yusupov and his team had achieved a great success by safely landing the plane in such a critical situation. No passenger or crew member lost their life during the landing. The aircraft's landing demonstrated how important each step was and how critical the pilot's composure was. The difficult landing was not only made possible by the pilot's skill but also by the cohesive teamwork and calmness of the entire flight crew. Throughout the process, the solidarity and trust between the passengers and the crew were crucial factors that saved lives at the end of the accident. The plane had been successfully landed in the field, and a major disaster was avoided. The challenging landing and rescue became a story of survival thanks to the professionalism and experience of the flight crew. Yusupov, Pirogov, and the crew had made history by executing a miraculous rescue through excellent teamwork. The 2019 Russia-Ural Airlines Flight 178 accident became an unforgettable success story in aviation history due to the extraordinary professionalism and courage of the flight crew. The plane, on its journey from Moscow to Sochi, unexpectedly aborted its flight after one of its engines completely failed, and the other was severely damaged. However, investigations and research conducted after the accident revealed that thanks to the extraordinary composure and professionalism of the pilots and crew, the tragic event ended successfully without turning into a disaster, saving the lives of 233 people. The initial statements following the incident highlighted the extraordinary success of the flight crew, especially Captain Damir Yusupov, in preventing this disaster. When the plane collided with a bird flock during takeoff, the engines sustained significant damage, making it impossible for the plane to continue flying normally. However, without panicking, the pilots made the right decisions and effectively directed the crew, landing the plane safely on a field with only a small margin. This difficult moment went down in history as one of the greatest miracles in modern aviation. Under Yusupov's leadership, the flight crew meticulously planned each step, maintaining control of the aircraft without panic, and demonstrated extraordinary effort to save the lives of the passengers. After the landing, passengers were quickly evacuated and no passengers or crew members lost their lives. The solidarity between the flight crew and the passengers formed the foundation of this miraculous rescue. After the incident, the pilots and crew were hailed as heroes worldwide. The plane had narrowly escaped a major disaster, and all passengers were safely evacuated. The professionalism of the flight crew was highly appreciated not only by airport authorities but also by the global aviation industry. Yusupov and his team were praised as exemplary figures, showcasing the best practices in aircraft accidents. In interviews after the incident, Yusupov emphasized how critical the situation was and how, with the help of their training and experience, they were able to emerge from it safely. Captain Yusupov received awards and honors in Russia and internationally after the accident. The flight crew was primarily recognized for their extraordinary composure and professionalism. Additionally, one of the key topics that gained further emphasis after this event in aviation worldwide was remaining calm during a crisis. The aviation community viewed this incident not only as an aircraft accident, but also as a lesson highlighting the importance of safety training in aviation. The rescue story received extensive coverage in news broadcasts around the world. In many countries, the event was aired on national television and generated a great deal of public attention. The pilot's heroism became an example not only for the aviation industry, but also for humanity as a whole. This incident showed just how critical it is for a well-trained and composed team to handle such a situation. The aircraft had narrowly escaped a major disaster, and the passengers were safely evacuated. The tension and jolts experienced during the landing remained unforgettable moments for both the passengers and the crew. However, the relief that followed immediately after the landing proved once again to the world how professional and skilled the flight crew was. Yusupov and his team became heroes not only in the aviation sector, but also among the public. Although Yusupov described himself as just a pilot doing his job. The gratitude toward him and his team grew on both national and international levels. In conclusion, this event was not just the story of an aircraft accident, but also a lesson about the importance of aviation safety training, as well as how composure, experience, and making the right decisions can be life-saving. The 2019 Ural Airlines Flight 178 accident led to a review of many safety protocols and training programs in aviation. As Yusupov and his team went down in history as global aviation heroes, this event remained in memory as one of the greatest miracles in modern aviation.